So that's the pointer. Pointer. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I think we're going to start now. We have here Justina Robinson. Thank you very much for being here with us today. Justina is a senior lecturer in English language and linguistics at the University of Sussex, United Kingdom. Her research focuses on semantic variation and change, sociolinguistics, cognitive linguistics, and how these interact. She is interested in developing methods for tracing and analyzing semantic variation and change, especially those that involve corpus experimental and sociolinguistic approaches. Her recent research includes linguistic lifespan change in English. She is also a co-investigator in collaborative AHRC project, Linguistic DNA, Modeling Concepts and Semantic Change in English, 1500 to 1800. So thank you very much, Justina.
Thank you so much for this generous introduction, and I'm so overwhelmed by your invitation and the warmth of your hospitality. I'm really happy to be here. So thank you very much. So the talk today will be largely about language change, okay? And I will be exploring various issues related to language change that I've been interested in for a while, actually. So I'm going to take you a little bit down the memory lane. We've got a lot of students here. We've got postgraduate students, masters, and research. So I will be talking a little bit about my experience at that time as well. You might find it interesting. Language change has always been something that interested me, and particularly semantic change. I don't know, it's quite appealing, the stories of words. Gay used to mean happy and now means homosexual, how it happened. I always like reading those chapters in books of linguistics. When I was undergraduate student, semantic change was usually represented in the following way. So usually there would be one word investigated across large periods of time. So the history of the word nice, for instance, and we find out that nice used to mean silly at some point, and researchers would investigate this history across dictionaries. So it was very much analysis detached from the context, so very much individual word across large periods of time. And how was semantic change described at this time? Very often it was described as more or less chain. Okay, this chain comes from my more recent research, which I will tell you about in a bit. But what is important is that semantic change has been seen as a progression from meaning A to meaning B, where overlaps exist between the older meaning and new meaning, and hence we have polysemy, so words that have more than one meaning. So those kind of chains of semantic change would be the only visualization that we've seen in the books in those days. But what those visualizations don't show is any kind of weight in importance of different senses in any given point in time. This visualization assumes that almost every sense is as frequently used as the other. But it wasn't the case. Actually, some circles should be larger, some smaller. So in the next part of my research, this was when I started doing my master's. I moved to a university which was very heavily oriented towards sociolinguistic research. And what I found out is that sociolinguists haven't been really looking into semantics, which really surprised me, because that's what I've been mainly reading about on my undergraduate study. So I thought, let's see if we can learn something about the usage of semantic category. So the most straightforward way of representing what you see here in terms of usage would be just to count the relative frequency of different senses across the whole category. So that's the visualization that would show that. So at any given point in time, here adjective gay was reported to have several different meanings across the community, with some meanings being more frequently used, like here the blue, gay homosexual, and some meanings less frequently used, like the older meaning gay happy. And those visualizations, based on the frequency of use at any given point in time, really lended themselves to creating theories of semantic representation in mind, especially the prototype theories. So Dirk Gerrits published a famous book on prototype diachronic semantics in late 90s, and this was the go-to book for anybody who wanted to do anything about meaning, variation, and change. And what he said is that that every meaning is a kind of category, or every word is a category, and the category has got its own structure. So it's not flat like this, but the structure will have more central meanings, prototypical meanings. They could be more salient, more frequent. There is some difference between those terms, but just to give you an idea, so more central meaning versus meanings that are more peripheral. So we know that the structure of the meaning of usage is not flat, but kind of gradable. And there are different things when it comes to semantic change and variation happening in the center of the category, and different things happening at the outskirts of the category. So for instance, if you were to put a bet of where semantic change can happen, you would probably say, well, it's likely to happen with those senses that are peripheral, rather than straight away affecting the core. And indeed, there is some evidence for that. So I wanted to find out where the change happens, okay? But how can we get from this flat representation to talking about this representation showing change? Well, this is where my luck was, because when I was doing my PhD at Sheffield University, with all those sociolinguists around me, I've learned about the apparent time hypothesis, which is a way of investigating change by using age as a proxy for change. So in other words, generational differences at any point in time in a community would be indicative of changes that are happening in real time. So it's a very attractive way of looking at change, because you don't have to wait for a period of time to pass in order to have some indication, at least of a trend, whether the change is a particular usage on the way up or down. So what I needed to do is to map this category across the age of participants in the study. And that's what it looked like. So at the x-axis, there are different generations. They are not having equal number of years. There is an equal number of people in which, but different kind of numbers of years in it. Ask me about it later if you'd like me to talk about generational split. This is the frequency, so out of 100%, how many percent of a given usage is represented by the given age group. So before I talk about change, let me describe this a bit more. So what we see here is, the recording people will not like me moving, but I have to. So all the red senses here represent what we've seen on the previous slide as the prototypical sense, the core sense for the community, homosexual. So we don't see major change going on there, but let's look at some other senses. Sense gay in terms of happy, represented by dark blue and lighter blue shades. Okay, let's just look at them together. So very clearly, if we map those sense across the age spectrum, the trend is very much indicative of disappearing usage. Okay, so I could actually see how the category that is just flat like that can be interpreted, can be shown in order to be indicating trends in semantic change. The same was with the new senses. I've marked it here as gay lame, but it's really a sense that is quite polysemous in itself. It can mean boring, unattractive, not related to sexuality. I just want to highlight that. And that's, so for instance, you can say that a movie was gay, or that a sandwich was gay, not just boring, bland, okay? We should be watching out this one, because there are so many small polysemous senses here unpacked in this category, and who knows, maybe there will be kind of some seismic shift coming, you know, and one sense emerging. But what we see here is that it's younger generations, notice the darker and lighter hues of green, that lead that, or that innovate that particular sense. So again, we could, when we compare this evidence to what we know about semantic change from dictionaries and corpus or from real-time data, indeed those trends correspond to what we see from real-time data. But what we have here as an advantage is that we know exactly in the community the change happens, because apart from the age of the speakers, we can look at the gender, we can look at the social class, we can go down to every single participant and trace the change, almost like by following some line, from the beginning to the end. I want to highlight also some interesting finding that came from the study here. So you see the two senses here, two colors, report to the one sense against in terms of happy. However, I wanted to highlight the instances where speakers were putting contextual constraints on using that sense. So for instance, saying, oh, I used to use gay in the sense of happy, but not anymore. Or I use sense of happy, but only with my friends, or only with my family, or only with my parents, but not children. Okay? So the element of reporting here became quite interesting, became important in terms of explaining how change progresses. Because I don't want to assume that anybody would have two senses in the mind, you know, this is just a representation of this lighter and darker blue. But what we see here is that as the sense disappears, the level of reporting increases. So what we can say is semantic change is not categorical. Right? So it's not just it's not an all or nothing phenomenon. So one day we have the meaning, the second day people just decide not to. So it doesn't only progress through different age groups, but also through different styles. Okay? And people change those styles across life. So they say, I used to use it everywhere. This was the word that we used to use all the time when we were young, and now I only use it in those contexts with those people. Okay, so again, we can trace semantic change across styles and contexts. We can trace the change across age, generations, genders, and also social classes. I've got some other studies to show that, but I'm going to move on because I want to tell you about an interesting sense that came up here. Okay, this was a sense that I marked as gay unmanly. So when I collected the data, there were 3 men in the late 20s who, when I asked what is gay, they would be saying like eating salads or carrying an umbrella or having half pint going fishing. So these were all those activities that they considered to be not accepted in the group of friends. Okay, so they were saying not the kind of in-group activities. So for instance, one of the speakers would say to me that, let me just find a quote. He says, because we use it because nobody in the group does it, okay? If I was with a group of male friends in an informal situation, then I would use it. So this is very much a marker also of identity. So that's the new thing that we're learning about semantic change. That it's not that the words don't have just a semantic meaning, but they also carry indexical meaning, social meaning. Okay, and that's something that really hasn't been explored that well. There's a new area of research saying how meaning is not just for the sake of changing, but it's also changing in order to show particular identities. So he unmanly shows an in-group identity and is mapped across various activities. So there's a whole embodiment of that meaning present in the group. So you can use this sense only if you are in a situation like eating the salad and having the half pint. So there's very kind of embodiment, socio-discursive feel about that use. It's not just the meaning for the sake of it. It's actually doing social work. Doing social work. More about gender, because we can view this data through different kind of lens. So here I present the same data, but I split it across the two different genders. What I've done here in red, I collapsed all the senses which were reported. So all the situations where people would be saying, I used to use this sense, but not anymore. And what we see here is that females do more of this talking about talk than males. Okay? Very interesting and perhaps not that surprising, knowing about other studies, sociolinguistic studies, of mainly phonological variation, which showed that women are a bit more aware of the different cues that come with use of the different variants. So it's interesting that across the piece, we've seen that females are doing more of this reporting. So we could kind of go on and interpret that, but then what I was interested in is thinking, okay, maybe gay is just a particular example. Okay, it is one of those examples that is in a way iconic, or it's the go-to example when you explain semantic change. So for instance, at some point I reviewed as many books on historical semantics as possible, or people who talk about semantic change, and gay was in most of them as the example showing semantic change. So I thought, is there something about gay? So for that reason, I looked at other adjectives that have been changing meaning in recent times. And I wanted to see whether if, let's say, a person is innovative, so if we go back, so for instance, if we see that the younger generations are innovative with that particular word, with that particular sense, would they also show some kind of innovative behavior? So is there something to the kind of collective consciousness that many young people would be innovative on many levels, not on just this one? So I've collected usage data on many other adjectives that were changing meaning at that time. So these were wicked and awesome and many others. And they were innovative at the time of collection, 2005. I know that for younger generation these days, they seem to be like older words. Just to give you an update, so the more recent changes now would be saying Gucci for good, using word eat for throw, so we eat it across the room, so it's Y-double-E-T, pig for bed, Now if you were to do study, you would perhaps change the adjectives. But at that point, I picked up what I knew that was happening in the community. And I wanted to find out then, again to repeat, if the same group of people is using innovative senses in similar way, if the same group of people is using conservative senses in the same way. So are we dealing with any patterns of kind of collective behavior here, not just behavior at the level of individual adjective or individual word? So in order to do that, I took many analyses like that for every single word, and I used something called cluster analysis, which is, it looks like that, okay? Don't worry about this, but just looks like that. So what this does, it's a really good way of showing that you do statistics without actually doing statistics, because that's exploration, is exploring of data. And that's just a way of saying how the different senses of all the adjectives I used cluster together from the point of being used in the similar way by the similar people. Okay, so if, for instance, I have this cluster together, it means that those senses are used in the similar way by similar people. Okay, similar way in terms of frequency. So I got 3 different clusters, and what I noticed, I'm going to zoom on one of those, the bottom cluster, for instance, is that older, more conservative, outgoing senses of the adjectives that I introduced were used or clustered together. So, for instance, gay sense of happy was in the same cluster as as awesome in sense of terrible. Okay, that's the sense where younger British people, which younger British people don't know even existed. So it's just that passed in the memory. And then that's another older going out sense, skinny in the sense of mean, not generous, not wanting to part with food or money. So they would say, older people say, government is skinny because they don't give us pensions. Or I used to be a skinny parent because I never gave pocket money to my children. Okay, so that's a kind of skinny mean. And then also gay, reporting on homosexual. So you see the same kind of person who is a user of gay happy will be also a user of skinny mean and awesome terrible, and also will be reporting on homosexual. Okay, so we have the kind of collective behavior here. The next question is to ask, well, so who are those people? We know that they are similar, or that they use the words in a similar way. And when I run now proper stats, I found out that indeed age was the major predictor for the whole classification. So mainly older people here would be in this cluster. Just to quickly say what happened in other clusters, so for instance in top cluster, I had all the newer senses clustered together as well. So the whole analysis, whole visualization kind of made sense from the historic point of view. I was very relieved to see that, because this was just, I generated it just before finishing my PhD. If it wouldn't work, I don't know what I would have done, but it did work quite nicely. And it showed that there is some kind of collective way of behaving, okay? That it's not, that the semantic patterns that we observed in terms of gay, adjective gay are not just relevant to that one adjective and to individual speakers, but they can be generalized across the piece here, across other evaluative adjectives. So this was quite exciting for me, but I still was thinking, okay, but how does it happen when there's kind of individual with their own conceptualization of the world and their own usage, and then there is a community with their own waves? How do they interact to create change or to resist change? So that's the kind of question that I've been thinking about more recently. So how to bridge the gap between individual cognitive system and then variation at the other level, how the individual usage can be reconciled with community usage in language change. So how those two map, because I felt that none of my research really so far talked about it. So I started reading about different types of cognition, and some authors like to split the kind of idea of the collective versus individual to kind of operationalize the problem, and I found it useful at the level of methodology. Say collective cognition involves mainly conceptualization, so what you think, and then how it's represented. It can be represented by language, but not only that. So think about certain concepts that are only represented by, let's say, pictures. If I say the concept of nativity, okay, there is a particular picture in mind, okay? Imagine that there is no word nativity, okay? And we do have that certain concepts are represented by music. Think about, let's say, going somewhere in the crowd and suddenly you just smell this perfume and it takes you all the way to your teenage years where you're in this nightclub and the story goes, right? So there's a concept in your mind, right? That it here is encoded through another of the cognitive faculties here. But I can only work with language here. So thinking about thinking and the language and the cognitive cognition, what we know about collective cognition, what we know about is that it is like a collective memory bank. I quite like this quote. So it is a memory bank of the community from the long time up till now. Think about different proverbs that don't make sense now, but they used to in some time. I recently learned what pulling somebody's leg meant. Does anybody know? Yeah, so it's quite a gruesome story, right? So when people were when they were penalized to die by hanging by the neck, children would be pulling the legs. Yes, so there were public executions. So there is a collective memory bank in terms of particular event, in terms of conceptualizations. But also what we know is that this memory bank is kind of distributed. Okay, distributed, which variably across community. So although we use the same language, we also have different experience with language, and there will be packets of groups of people who will be using the language differently. Think about my gay example, how there were different generations tapping to this resource as gay, as adjective gay, and using it slightly differently. We also know that the cognition is situated, so it kind of makes sense only when the context, when there is behavior going on. I'm just going to check the time. I think that, okay. And then what we know about, and we also know about collective cognition is that it keeps changing. Dynamic, it's emergent, negotiated. So I'm just interested in this last bit, negotiated. How does collective and the individual negotiate that the new form is coming in or going out? So I started looking at the individual cognition, which is the actual locus of cognition. Each of us have the agency to either react to change in the way that we accept the change that is going on at the community level, or to reject the change, or just, one of those two. And what we also know that we integrate our new experiences in our language on the very kind of individual level. And what I managed to get from when I was reading this literature to a conclusion that language change is seen as a kind of this complex adaptive system, where there's a feedback loop between the different individual parts of the community and the kind of conversation, so very much kind of negotiated. But I still didn't know what it meant. I know it makes sense, but what does it mean? So I only went so far when it comes to social psychology or cognitive linguistics. I thought that sociolinguistics could help me a bit more to understand the relationship between individual and the community. Okay, and I did find representations like that. Let me just explain it. So there was on the basis of a number of studies, sociolinguists have decided to put together different scenarios that happen at the level of individual speaker and at the level of community, and see what happens when it comes to language change. Okay, so what happens, for instance, when individual changes the way they speak, but there is no actual language change at the level of community. Okay, so they've been thinking about, sociolinguistics have been thinking about those issues, I would say, in the last 10 years. So the first examples of those tables like that come from early 2000. And they gave different names to what happens. So for instance, let's ignore the stability. There's the kind of communal change. So an example where suddenly everybody is required to use a new term. So let's say, think about some politically correct terms. So at some point it's illegal to, let's say, use particular term to refer to minority speakers. Or I don't know, if Our Majesty the Queen passes away, let's hope not, okay, we'll have to suddenly have to use the word king everywhere. So that's a kind of communal change. So I'm not going to be interested in these too much, but more in these two. So when there is stability at the level of individual, but community changes, we're dealing here with the apparent time hypothesis. So let me just unpack that. So apparent time hypothesis, so what I've shown you that is happening with the adjective gay, relies on the fact that language for the individual speaker more or less stops changing in the early adulthood. Okay, and that's based on the critical period hypothesis, long time ago. So there's a lot of innovation change in the adolescence. Tagliamonte talks about even like peaks in adolescence. Think about the S-curve of language change. So there's this kind of the big S, the change, and then you are expected to almost stop the innovation and carry the way you speak until the older age. And it does show to work in practice. So for instance, if you now speak to a speaker who is in the 80s or 90s, I'm sure that they will have some characteristics in the language that would be showing that they were adolescents or early adults now in the 40s, right? Because you can trace the language change there. So that's the kind of assumption of the apparent time hypothesis. And apparent time hypothesis really doesn't allow much changes in the post-critical period time. So from adulthood onwards, you almost don't change. Okay, that's the assumption. Then they also talk about cases of age grading. So for instance, situations where a particular feature is used only by a generation, but it's used in the same way by the same generation at every single generational point. It doesn't lead to language change. So I'm also not interested too much in age grading because it doesn't lead to change. I'm interested in this one. And more recently, these two came onto the picture. Okay, so sociolinguists that have been looking at language change across lifespan, across the life of speakers, there are very few of them so far, notice that sometimes individuals do change the way they speak in the middle age period or even later. And they can change into different directions. So you can either pick up the new innovations, and they call it lifespan change. I don't like the term very much because every change is across life as lifespan, but I'm going to use it for the time being. So when they say lifespan change, it's like picking new innovations. Whereas if you do the opposite, so for instance, if you started using something new when you were a teenager or in your early adulthood, and then by middle ages, let's say you go back on the change. So it's called retrograde change. Okay? And what is the effect of this scenario, a community versus individual, on the actual language change. So the level of language change, lifespan change, will increase the speed language change happens. Okay? And I would want to even suggest that this process is responsible for rapid changes, dramatic changes, or even changes to opposite. When it comes to semantics, scholars have been often wondering how come a word can change the meaning so dramatically. So weak and good to bad, and then awesome the same. So how can this happen? And it often, I want to hypothesize that it happens through intense kind of lifespan change. Okay? Whereas retrograde change will decrease the speed of change. So you will see in the analysis in a minute that some older speakers throughout their life started using gay in the sense of homosexual. Okay, so they did that, lifespan change. But later in their life, they decided not to use it, and they retrograde. Okay, so they at some point increase the speed of change and then decrease the speed of change. And this kind of behavior actually would explain why any language change, we know it from studies of corpus change, has got, like, we call it long tail. So the S-curve, okay, I'm assuming that we know about this curve, yes, so the peak and this, and then there's like long tail, right, of speakers who are still using the particular variant. And I think these are the speakers who are responsible for that. What I wanted to do is actually to find out what's happening with semantics when it comes to those patterns of change, following the model that sociolinguistics has developed. So I decided to interview the same group of speakers across the period here. It's only 10 years, but still we have some interesting findings. So the previous data that I've been showing you come on the basis of survey of speakers that were from, mainly from Sheffield, but from outside Sheffield as well, from South Yorkshire in UK. They were all born and bred in the area. They were all ethnically white. There was equal distribution of different age groups, gender, socioeconomic classes. So you see it was very kind of heavily controlled sample. And then 10 years later, I managed to get access to 10 of the same speakers. And most of them were in these age groups. So these were the speakers that would have the same email address or telephone number. So that's a kind of convenience, in a way, a convenience sample. Although I had a couple of older, actually, there were 73. So I've re-interviewed those speakers, asking about the usage, and repeated every element of the original data collection as faithfully as I could. So it was me who was collecting data. If I interviewed them in the office, I would invite them to some kind of, not office, some university room, or I would go to the house. So I tried to really control for all other factors when it comes to the experiment. The only thing allowed to vary is actually how they respond to questions. What were the questions? I didn't tell you that. So when I wanted to find out how they use word, let's say gay, I wouldn't ask them, what does gay mean to you? Because then it's problematic. I asked them, who or what is gay? And they would, and I put some kind of cognitive pressure so that they could give me the free answers as soon as they could. And then I asked, why is this, let's say, sandwich gay? And then they would give me explanation, which was my cue to the meaning. And then I grouped similar meanings into the groups that you've seen on the charts before. So group of meaning, gay homosexual, or gay happy, or gay lame. So this was the kind of data collection. This was also followed by a conversation about the language use among younger speakers, older speakers, dialect, etc. I will be occasionally tapping to this data as well. But let's just focus on those middle-aged speakers. So I thought, okay, what do we know about language of middle-aged speakers? And we don't know much, actually. We really don't know much. So what sociolinguists say? They talk a lot about language until that point. So Chambers says when it comes to change across lifetime, he says, well, in childhood we use that, and the family of friends. In adolescence we do this. In young adulthood we've got standardization and linguistic market pressures, and then it stops. It almost assumes that language is slightly fixed by adulthood. Okay, so I kept looking. And usually what happens is the middle age seems to be this kind of normative stage in life where other stages are being compared to. So younger speakers are compared to, obviously, the next generation up, but this generation is not explored. So it's a stage in kind of a limbo in between, and nobody really looks at it properly. And it's past critical period, so it shouldn't really have much variation. Eckert, a while ago, noticed that in terms of sociolinguistics, it's a middle-age language. Investigation of middle-age language is a vast wasteland in the study of variation. So I thought, okay, so there is a gap. But then I kept reading about very few studies. There are mainly, less than 10 studies that at some point looked at language of people who are in the middle age across life. Bowie was one of them. And he looked at network of friends and how they change across life. And he noticed that friends who were very close, had similar jobs and everything, still ended up speaking very differently. And he says, oh, I get conflicting conclusions. I really don't know what's going on here because none of the sociolinguistic characteristics such as job, social status, network explains that. Sankov and Blondeau keep talking about this stage of life being very idiosyncratic. So if your career changes, then it's going to change the way to speak, but overall it's quite idiosyncratic. And then even looking at studies of the kind of at community level doesn't help me with understanding middle-age language, because this stage of life is conceptualized differently by different people. What is considered middle age this day and age in Western Europe is different to what it was for the previous generation, like with younger people staying with the parents for longer periods. Certainly we see it with our university students that the model of leaving home for university and living somewhere else has been disrupted by the fees, and many of the young people actually stay at home and then commute. And then it changes the idea of adolescence, changes the idea of middle age. So community itself is a kind of moving target. So it's not like you can take it as a given what middle age is. So I really went to the area that was quite messy, and I would say that first reaction when you read something like that, it's just fear, like what am I doing? And then you just think, okay, there's actually an opportunity. There's an opportunity, a gap in research. So what do we know about lifespan change in the middle age group? So when it comes to picking up on innovations, there is more anecdotal evidence than the actual linguistic evidence. So what is the anecdotal evidence? That parents pick up language from their children. Okay, I don't know, I certainly do. I just picked up that word eat, and certainly when I have my teenage daughter with her friends in the car, I try to build a rapport by using some words that I know that will do the social work. So when they were in primary school, they had the whole hoo-ha about the word humongous, because the teacher told them that it's not a real word. So we had the whole conversation, and I knew that that word will give me access to that group. So I was doing the social work. So there is a lot of this anecdotal evidence that we change the way we speak, not so much linguistic kind of studies evidence. What we definitely know, apart from the first bullet point, which I discussed before, is that as we age, awareness of change increases. So as we age, we somehow experience the change, and we develop more or less conscious comments, conceptualization of the given change. Okay, and we'll just remember, let's remember it because it will become important in a minute. When it comes to retrograde change, there is more studies, or more findings, there are just a couple of findings really, from studies on individual variation. So middle-aged speakers and older speakers would react to linguistic market pressures. So for instance, Buchstaller talks about reduction of the use of quotative like among speakers who entered professional jobs, and they were in the 30s. Okay, she talks about it as mid-30s retreat. So you kind of go back on that language because it doesn't fit with the collective cognition. Okay, it doesn't fit with the collective what it is to be a professional in England now, and therefore those speakers retrograde. But the retrograde change also goes beyond middle age period. So there's a very interesting study by Mackenzie and Ornrod. They looked at the language of David Attenborough, who, does anybody watch Blue Planet? Okay, very famous kind of journalist and documentary maker. And we have a lot of data, speaking in the same context, from when he was a young man to up till now. And what they've noticed is that as he aged, he actually became more conservative with how he pronounces R's. So he became more rhotic, okay? Because, as they suggest, it marks then his seniority, his status, and the confidence, okay? So he goes back on that pronunciation, okay? So the interesting changes going on there, and that's as much as we know about language change across life for middle-aged speakers. What did my speakers do? I'm just checking the time. This button? Yes. Okay, not much time, so I'll just be quick. When it comes to 2015, there are two different groups of speakers that do different things with gaze. I haven't got a separate frequency chart for you because I only have 10 speakers, but I just wanted to map what they do against what they did in 2005. And what I noticed that for the group of speakers here, there is a lot of change. And group of speakers here, there is very little change. Okay, and why would it be the case? Why different age groups change the usage across life very differently? Let me start with the older speakers. For them, what they actually do is they reject gay. So what they just say, you know what, I just don't use this word. That's it. They refuse to even answer the question, who or what is gay? Which is different to what it was 10 years ago. They say it's kind of uncomfortable or perhaps pragmatically risky. Let me just show you some quotes. I wouldn't use gay, happy, comfortably now. It's PC. I know someone whose daughter is called gay. If you said now gay, it would mean homosexual. I think it's really, really uncomfortable word. You can just feel this almost visceral response. Okay, really uncomfortable. So I just reject that. I don't use this expression in case you are treading on somebody's toes or offending someone. So you know what's the safest strategy? Just not use it. And again, I wouldn't use it. Nowadays, you notice that the speakers compare that usage to the usage that they acquired when they were young. Okay, gay, happy, and again, happy. Okay, so those speakers. So there were two speakers, 73, and then one towards the end of the 60s, and they all kind of rejected gay. They all retired. They are outside of the linguistic market. They don't need to care in a way, and they're just true to how they feel. Throughout their life, they felt somehow uncomfortable, perhaps because what I suggested, there was some kind of cognitive clash here in terms of the conceptualization of the new gay homosexual for them and gay happy. Somehow pragmatically they couldn't in a way fit it. But they did. They adopted it. But then, when they could, when they were out of linguistic market, they just say, you know, I just don't care. Reject that. Okay, so that's an interesting example of showing how community consciousness here and community usage plays on individual usage. And then individuals are kind of playing the game in a bit. Just, yes, they've adopted community usage, but they can get, when they get out, they do get out. What it means for the semantic change? It means that they first increase the speed of change, and then they go back, right? So I'm just like dancing. I will compare this to salsa, right? You go forward and back. It's this kind of movement. So there was a lot of change across the 10 years for those speakers. For the younger speakers, gay homosexual is not an issue, okay? There are interesting things happening about other changes. So for instance, one of the speakers who used gay unmanly was re-interviewed by me 10 years later. I will call him Jonathan. And Jonathan now really marginalizes the use of gay instead of unmanly, but he says that his life changed since then. So since then, so when I interviewed him, he was a postgraduate student, he was still living with his parents, and his kind of self-defined class was working class. Then he finished his university in the last, in those 10 years, got married to an oncologist, moved to Leeds, started working for university. So his social status dramatically kind of rose. He entered professional circles. He doesn't hang out with the same group of friends. So there's not many kind of contextual opportunities to be using this as gay and manly only makes sense when there's this context. Okay, so it only makes sense to use when there's a community towards which you can align yourself towards, and another community that you can separate yourself from. Okay, in 10 years, that's a peripheral use. So we can see that lifespan change happens because of changes in our environment. What was particularly interesting, and that's the last example that I want to talk about in detail, was what women who were in this group, so one was, so there were 48, 50, and early 60, I think. They all did very interesting thing. In 2005, they used both senses, gay happy and gay homosexual. 10 years later, they use gay homosexual, but they start reporting on gay happy, and they start expressing negative comments about gay homosexual. Let's start again. So there were 3 of them were university administrators. That's where I just put them together. So let me see if I've got a quote for that. I do, but I will just maybe leave it. So those speakers would be using, in earlier period, gay happy and gay homosexual equally, and no evaluative comments. 10 years later, they report or restrict the usage of happy, so they restrict the usage of older sense. Makes sense, okay, we know that this is disappearing, but they accompany it by extremely negative comments about homosexual. And that's the puzzle, okay? So they are negative, kind of more negative than they used to be towards gay homosexual, but they keep using the sense. They take it out on gay happy. Okay? They take it out on gay happy. Let me just show you the example now. Okay, so Julia is one of those speakers. So in 2006, she would say, I have not any gay friends, as in the sexual gay, but I will try not to think of gay as the type. It means happy, jolly, so I know lots of gay, happy, jolly people. That's all. In 10 years, what happens? First of all, look at the size of her comments. And what I said before, that as change progresses, there is more awareness of the change. All the comments, and across 10 years, were more bulky, more emotive as well. I'm going to read this one, okay? Look, this is a ridiculous one. That's how she starts. Because gay, when I was a child, meant happy, meant just jolly, meant just happy, jolly, nice person. But now gay means people that are homosexual, whether it's lesbians or gay men. And I would say that mostly in the language that I listen to, gay tends to refer to men rather than women. They say gay men or they say lesbians. We don't refer to gay women as gay. We give them a lesbian title, but yeah, gay homosexuals. It just meant happy and jolly because my mom always used to say she's a bonny and gay little girl. And that just meant like a chubby, happy, fat, nice, jolly girl. It was more to describe somebody that was happy and friendly rather than because it was a weird thing, because it's a complete opposite. The community-wide usage by employing various discursive phrases. So, for instance, she would have a very clear kind of explanation of what happy meant. She gives us many, many synonyms. For gay homosexual, she doesn't. Okay? And it's like she almost, when she talks about gay homosexual, she cannot finish the sentence. Look, we give them a lesbian title, that's fine, but yeah, gay homosexuals, full stop. Okay, it's just like, I don't know how to even kind of conceptualize it then. She acknowledges, okay, she gives we kind of a first person pronoun when she talks about gay, lesbian, but not about gay. She frames the discourse between the discussion between the two different senses in the context on the temporal axis. So she situates her evaluation in the temporal context. So the events from her childhood versus now. Okay, there and now. And there and now is not just a chronological description. It also serves to be kind of intersubjectively helping her to frame the opposition, because what was then is not now, what is now is not then. So she really sees those senses as separate, and she's more nostalgic towards this kind of older sense. Really, the straightforward comments only come from words like ridiculous, that she say weird as well, but you see how roundabout ways she uses to talk about gay. Then it's a weird thing, because it's complete opposite. She cannot almost like frame what gay homosexual means. Really, she couldn't elaborate on that. So I wanted to draw a couple of conclusions from this example. Speakers are aware of the community kind of consciousness and community usage, and they react to that in ways that are very subtle. Okay, so she reacts to this by reacts to the community usage of adjective gay by constructing this whole narrative of before and now, and also by acknowledging that gay homosexual is not for her a sense that comes closer, kind of closer to her usage. I'm just losing my thought. I wanted to say that what? I must have it written somewhere. Okay, I'll just say that. So there's this kind of collective cognition used to contextualize individual cognition. And the speaker is not out of linguistic market yet to do the rejection scenario. They still have to use gay instead of, in terms of homosexual. But what they can do at that point is to reject happy. Okay, so they do kind of take the evaluative stance, negative stance towards gay homosexual by reducing the use of happy. They cannot reduce the sense of homosexual because that's that's sanctioned by the community, and they cannot go against that yet, as long as they are within the linguistic market. I suggest that when those speakers retire, they will be behaving like my current older speaker would say, you know what, I don't care, just don't use this word. That's what I wanted to say. Okay, conclusions. Doesn't give us much time for questions. Goodness. Relationship between collective and individual cognition. We see that individual cognition strongly embodies the context and the environment, the personal experience. Think about the gay and manly guy. It's very much situated in time, where we talk about different, let's say, experiences from now and then. We also see that sometimes when individuals are at odds with the collective usage, they react by changing linguistic usage in complex and subtle ways. So, for instance, they can report on gay in terms of happy. What I've learned about language change here is that what seems to be idiosyncratic, like why does this woman report on happy, but she likes happy? It goes against the logic. Well, we need to have the full picture. And when I interviewed her and when I got her stances towards the whole adjective, rejecting gay happy actually makes sense. So what is seemingly idiosyncratic individual change can be explained if stances are explored. I also learned that what is kind of from the point of view of community seen as idiosyncratic from the individual viewpoint is actually not, okay? It's like a salsa, what I said, you have those forward and retrograde movements that participants do in the community, but it's all coherent and logical when we know all the coordinates. Okay, so the next step is just to look for more coordinate stances, metalinguistic comments. I feel like as semantics, we going now the full circle from looking at the individual words to then going through the empiricism, corpus linguistics. Now I suggest going back to local constructions of semantic meaning in the discourses of individual speakers. I feel that's the next step forward. Okay, thank you so much, and thank you for the patience. I didn't realize such a long time. And I'm eating onto another speaker's.
Justina, thank you so much. It was very, very, very interesting, at least for me, because I'm not very aware of, it's not my experienced field, but I found it so interesting. I think we have maybe just 5 minutes to questions. Do we have any questions? No? Because both at the same time. Joanne.
It's on? Yeah. Okay, I'm wondering what would happen. Of course, that would ruin your PhD thesis. If you're working with a very fixed community, I suppose, and people who are not moving around a lot. Mm-hmm. So I wonder what would happen if you studied different age groups in places where people are moving around a lot. Mm-hmm. So their changes would not, as you said at the beginning, would not recognize what mother and father used because it's no longer their speech community. So you couldn't do that in your thesis, of course, but it would seem to me to be very different if the speech community would be much wider than your Yorkshire group.
Absolutely. I mean, the beginnings of my research, that's why I took you kind of chronologically almost to when I was a student, were to test a particular methodology. So that's why the community was so constrained to allow me to measure the variation. The challenge is to look at highly dynamic communities with the input of, let's say, many different varieties of English. I'm just thinking about, let's say, current kind of ethnically mixed London or other cities, urban centers like that. But I do think that in order to work with such communities, the local context becomes even more important. So kind of looking at the local discourse level, local communities, local networks. Yeah. Anyway, I don't know if it answers your question. We can talk about it, I guess.
Yes, I know you couldn't do that in your thesis. You would never have finished.
Yeah, that was I had a different mindset and a different aim. I guess I wanted to do what sociolinguists did with phonology, 40, 50 years ago. So I needed to start somewhere. But I have already postgraduate PhD students who are finishing now, taking the next step. So actually doing ethnographic research, where they are interested in those localized meanings that emerge apart from the semantic meaning. I think we're starting to go somewhere very interesting with that, because it's not a kind of common response from sociolinguists to think that if the word changes the meaning, that the meaning can have a social value additionally, and that it can have many social values even for the same speaker, many of those in indexical meanings. But we see that that's happening here.
Very difficult to measure.
Yes, it is. Whether measurement, doing the local, investigating local data doesn't have to be relying on measurement, I guess, but then you can scale up. What I'm also doing as part of another project is that I'm working with trying to create databases that would have all the sociolinguistic information as well as local narratives. So that's how I'm hoping to be measuring data. So I've been working with, I have a corpus of diaries, diary responses from many speakers who can be traced from the point of view of the socio-demographic criteria, and they respond to the same topic. So they all write a diary, let's say, about the royal wedding or the NHS or whatever, or Brexit, right? So I've got a lot of speakers writing about the same topic, and I have the socio-demographic information about those speakers, and I have the same speakers contributing to this database across time. So that's where I hope to be combining local analysis with the quantitative data, because there are many of those volunteers who write for that project. So that's something that is also one of my interests now. Thank you. Thank you for your question.
So I'm afraid we don't have time for more questions, but we can have the lunch break. We have another coffee break. I don't know what time, but in the evening. So we will have plenty. What is that? Oh, so we will have plenty of time to just talk about this amazing presentation that Justina just gave us. So thank you very much again, and we'll start with the parallel sessions in rooms DO1 and DO2.
It's all 15 minutes delayed.
Sorry?
15 minutes delayed, or was it the break now?
No, we have until 1:30, is it? Well, 1:45 now. Okay, so it's 1 hour.
Thank you.